Well, now that Jenna's jumped in, let me introduce her.
Sorry, I got too excited.
Oh, that's great. Um, so uh, she is somebody I've worked with a good bit at Cisco, and the fact that she both is, a senior people person leading human resources strategy for a large organization, a $20 billion business, gives her some perspective. But she's also a Forbes 30 under 30 founder and a CEO with a strong reputation for action and scaling organizations. She herself runs a large team of people, uh, and has worked as an executive coach. Uh, she has an MBA from Kellogg, and she has square danced with Jimmy Carter. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of her. So say a bit more, Jenna, about your perspective on this. And thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this whole topic of culture and team building and leadership.
Thank you. It was great to watch this presentation again. And one thing that you've made me think about, Chris, is whether there's a connection between founders and those who do extreme sports, because as you know, I also love long distance running. And I think maybe there's some sort of grit, resilience piece, struggle piece that's in that. So I'm going to be reflecting on that over the weekend. Team, I know this goes without saying because you've been with Chris for several months now, but Chris is one of my favorite leaders at Cisco, probably one of the smartest humans I've ever had the chance of working with. And I always say that my brain feels bigger after I'm with him. So, Chris, it's great to be here. Maybe I'll start just by talking a little bit about what's different about culture and team building in startups versus big companies. Would that work for you, Chris? Does that
Yeah,
sound
sure.
okay? Okay,
Sorry, would it be possible to ask another question just before we
of
jump
course.
into
Go
that?
for it.
Yeah.
I had my hands up, but
Oh,
maybe it
oh, oh,
wasn't
I'm
seen.
sorry I missed you.
No worries.
Go ahead.
So, so I have a actual question related to culture, communication, transparency, and the
Yeah.
level of personal expertise. Um, as a former university professor, I observed a certain phenomenon with especially university professors where people who are very successful in what they do, they, of course, develop high self-esteem, and they tend to extrapolate their knowledge, their skill, and their level of success more broadly. So this leads sometimes to awkward situations when a person very confidently jumps into something new to them, and their level of skill in that area doesn't match their previous successes, right? And this is sometimes obvious from the outside, but very difficult to communicate. So I wanted to ask, first of all, if you see this, if you see this not only with
Every
university
day.
professors, and okay, good, and what can be done about
Every
this?
day. I mean, it's the whole phenomenon of often in error, never in doubt. Uh, this industry, this class of technology does breed people who are highly confident sometimes, and you have to figure out which pieces of that confidence are warranted and which is not. And when somebody is highly confident, um, how do you deal with the fact that they're not equally competent in every area where they're highly competent, highly confident? So it's a balancing act. It's something that you have to, first of all, learn in yourself. Because those of us who start companies often are in fact the people you're talking about, the people who have had some success in one area and which believe that they can easily carry it to another. And they may have a, a better average than some people who don't have that confidence, because confidence can be a very positive skill for getting things done. But a level of self-awareness of your own competence is really important. And then when you come across it in other people, you have to make a judgment. You have to go assess, are they actually making sense in this area that they are claiming newfound brilliance in? Do you need to steer the conversation back to their area of true competence? Because sometimes people will get out in front of, get ahead of themselves. They may have the ability to learn that area. And just because they have more confidence than competence today doesn't mean that in 3 years they may in fact have developed quite considerable competence in that new area. And when you're dealing with them, you may have to go figure out what's bullshit and what's not. When you're managing them, you may have to direct them into areas where you get full benefit of their true competence and give them some opportunities to build their competence in some other areas. But take with a grain of salt their pontifications in other areas.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Igor, I was chatting with a CEO the other day who had a PhD level brilliant expert at their startup. But this person just they felt like they were the star of every show. And there was one meeting, the CEO was meeting with another CEO who's quite famous. You'd all know the name of this person. And this individual burst into the room to say, like, I have this issue. I need to talk to you about it now. And so we were just talking about, I think that confidence, that ego can be there. And I think it's also important as a leader to make clear what's acceptable, what's not, and that, the best of ideas are welcome at this table. Ego that dominates all is not. And ultimately, the CEO, had to make a very difficult decision that this person was not the best fit for their company after many, many attempts to help bring this person back down to the values of the company. So anyway, I just share that story because you reminded me of it. But any other questions for Chris before I jump in? I don't want to monopolize Chris.
I think we're safe to go on.
Okay. All right.
So what's different about a startup?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference to me is when you have a startup, you're not inheriting a culture, you're creating it. And so every decision that you make, who you hire, how you reward, how you communicate, that's all tied to your culture. And when my co-founder and I were starting our organization, we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the values, what's the vision of our organization. And then, those weren't just posters on the wall. They were embedded into every decision that we used. They were the compass with which we made those decisions. And they were incorporated into chants, into rituals, into awards. They guided everything that we did. And the second thing that I will say is it's important to have that groundwork. But then I think as a founder, it's important to remember that foundation is not static. It's a living system. My co-founder and I, every single year, we'd sit down with our team. We'd say, are these values still working for us? And we'd update those. And I think what that signaled to me over time was that wasn't showing that we were drifting. It was showing that we were growing. And the last comment that I'll make on values and all of those pieces is that I think because we had such a strong quote unquote culture on paper, we had the values, we had the mission, we had the vision, we had operating systems. I think I underestimated the importance of listening, partly because I think you're so proximate to your team in the early days. You're all in the same room. You're all working together. It didn't seem to me like I needed to take time to lift up and gather feedback. But what I realized over time was that that was an important thing to do. And research shows that anonymous surveys, even in small groups, you get about 60% higher levels of honesty than if you're asking someone face to face. So you should still always ask for feedback face to face, but I learned to layer that with the anonymous feedback. And when my co-founder and I would do that quarterly, we'd then debrief the results with our team. We'd share, here's what we heard, here's what we're changing, here's what we heard and what we can't change, and here's the why and the context. And here's what we heard, and here's what we'd love you to take ownership of. Let's start up a sprint or a working group to fix this. And I think this really helped to build trust, to create ownership. I'll share when we started doing this, we increased employee retention by 69% in a single year. And there were many reasons for that, but this was a huge part of that. The last thing I'll say, working at a large company, is that everything that I just said is true, but I think what becomes more important is the micro cultures. People join companies because of the mission of the vision, but they either stay or leave because of the manager. There's a study that shows that half of employees, they may love their job, but they're leaving because of who their boss is. And what I think that signifies is that, in a startup's early days, you're one team, you're all working together. But as you grow, decisions and culture start to spread through the micro teams rather than through osmosis of the same team in a room. And there's this anthropologist, Robert Dunbar, who talks about, you might be familiar with this already, but he talks about the amount of relationships that human beings can have. And overall, human beings can sustain about 150 meaningful social relationships. And if we break that down into layers, we can have about 5 people in our closest circle, 15 people that are in our quote unquote trusted group, 50 people that we can collaborate with regularly, and then 150 that we can recognize and maintain some sort of familiarity with. And what that means in practice is that as your company grows beyond, 30 people, those natural micro communities will form. And that's not wrong. That just means that you have to start thinking about how you manage those micro cultures and how you create systems and rituals and practices and training for those leaders to reinforce the broader values of your organization.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to recognize also that even when you say, I'm doing a startup, there is a lot of evolution from the startup when it's 3 people around a cafe table, and when it's 20 people, and when it's 100 people. And that evolution needs to maintain significant continuity of commitment and key elements of culture. But the mechanisms that you use, how you actually talk to 100 people, is different from 30 people. One of the things that I always made a pretty overt slogan for what I was trying to do with a startup company was to make it look bigger than life from the outside, to have impact on the industry, to have people say, well, based on the what these people are doing and what they're delivering and the size of their vision, that's a big, powerful company. And to make it smaller than life from the inside. That is, maybe we're 100 people, but we feel like 50. Maybe we're really 50 people, but we feel like 20. That more people get into those inner circles that you just described, or feel that they're part of that because of the attitudes of the people who are there, including the leaders, and the means of communication that make it as transparent as possible, so you know as much as you can about what all those people are doing. Mostly on the professional stuff, but even if you're picking up some things about what's going on with them personally, that's good in terms of making things feel small. So small from the inside, really big from the outside.
I love that. I think too, as companies grow, and I see this with some of the CEOs that I coach, I think you have to be really planful and proactive about your growth, because the time to start creating that increased communication that you talk about, Chris, and the structures and the systems that will support those microcultures, it's so important to do that proactively before you rapidly grow than to try to circle back and do that. And so I just counsel you to think about that as you grow. Hopefully all of you are growing rapidly.
Yeah. Certainly the makeup of a team and the makeup of a leadership team is a critical thing. And what are the principles that you think about, or you think we should think about, in creating that mosaic, that collection of skills and personalities that make up a strong leadership team? Because you probably don't want 6 people who all have exactly the same strengths and exactly the same weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
How do you construct that? How do you think of that?
I want to say thank you, Chris, because I think you talk about diversity in your presentation, and I think it's often overlooked. But to me, diversity it's diversity of experiences, of thought, and there's so much research from McKinsey and others that shows that companies that have more diverse teams have more innovation and therefore have stronger bottom lines. When I think about, I don't mean to sound like a broken record about values, but whether you're a startup or a Fortune 500, I think you have to start with the values. So alignment on mission, vision, that's non-negotiable as you're hiring. I think you can teach skills, but you can't teach importance, you can't teach integrity, you can't teach purpose. So you really have to make sure that your hiring practices are sifting and filtering for the right people. And then I think, as you build a leadership team, build for complementary strengths. My co-founder and I are very, very different individuals, and we designed our work and how we split our work based on our personality and our skill sets. And then as we kept growing the team, we didn't try to clone our strengths. We kept filling those gaps and hiring great people that could do that. Another thing that I learned was, and I learned this over time, was hire for drive and learning ability, not just pedigree. If I take myself as an example, when I started my startup, I had never built a budget. I had never permitted a building. I had never raised capital, but I was relentless. I was, curious. I was resourceful. And I think startups thrive on that type of energy. And some roles, of course, demand deep expertise. You might need someone who can code or who has a PhD in a very specific area. But I think a lot of startup founding is about finding people who have grit and that curiosity and hunger, and making sure that you're making room to teach them and help to grow them into those roles. I was talking with a startup CEO a couple of weeks ago, and he only hires employees from very elite schools. And I shared with him very honestly that I didn't feel like that was a great strategy. I think from a status perspective, it probably attracts people to their company, but some of the best people that have worked for me have come from very unconventional paths. I once hired someone whose career had been as a server in a restaurant, and she ended up being the best operations leader I ever had. And if you think about it, it makes sense. She knew how to read people. She knew how to stay calm under pressure. She could solve problems fast. And that's startup life in a nutshell. And so, I do think that diversity of experience, it leads to sharper decisions, it leads to better outcomes. Also, as you hire, and this again was a lesson that I learned over time, use scenario-based interviews. In the beginning, I used to hire people because they were great storytellers. And then I realized they could just sell. They couldn't really do the work. And so whether it's asking someone to code in front of you, to build a forecast, if they're in finance, to design a hiring plan, if they're in people, to operationalize a process, those are all ways in real time to test, can they do the work? And then pay attention to how they think, to the questions that they ask, how they receive and respond to feedback. And the last thing that I'll say is always, always make sure that you're in selling mode too. There's this great quote from the former chief people officer of Netflix. And she says, even if someone doesn't end up working for your company, you always want them to walk away having fallen in love with your company. And so at every aspect of that hiring process, be in pitch mode. And then the last thing I'll say about that mosaic is codify how your leadership team works together. Whether it's now with my current team or as a startup, I would sit down with my team and we'd write down our strengths and make sure we were familiar with those. We'd align on the brand and the value that we wanted to deliver. And we'd also identify the rituals that we wanted to follow. So we meet weekly as a team. We have one-on-ones. We meet quarterly for an on-site. And on that last topic of on-sites, I think it's really, really important, even as a founder where every single day is crazy, to take time to intentionally step away, to lift up and to ask yourself, do I have product market fit? What are my customers saying about the products that I'm creating? Are we spending our energy on the right things at the right time? And I think if you don't intentionally carve this out, you'll miss those indicators, and that could lead to your startup not being successful. So if I leave you with one thing, it's even amidst all of the chaos, make sure that you're pulling up to see the forest from the trees.
That's great. Thank you. There's a question from RJ. Go ahead, RJ.
Yeah, I've heard a couple startups mention a recent practice that I think is really cool, but I don't know how practical it is, in which they quote unquote hire a late stage interviewee for a 2-day or so, sort of let's solve a real problem together. And they work with like the hiring manager in front of a whiteboard or writing code to solve some real problem for the company that can be carved out for 2 days. Have you seen this? What do you think about it? It seems really attractive to me, but I don't know how realistic it is.
In the case of Babel Labs, we did this a lot with technical people. And sometimes it would be 2 days. Sometimes it would be a contract for months. We'd hire somebody as a contractor because we wanted certain work done, but we also really had as our motivation to figure out, well, how good are they really? And we hired a number of very strong technical people. And I think especially in Europe, we did this, but around the world, we found it a pretty effective way of doing it. Now, not everyone is willing to do that because it's a pretty big commitment on their part to do that. But you know, if they've just finished their PhD, they may be perfectly happy to do a contract if they haven't landed in a position yet. And of course, the more time you spend with somebody, and the more time you working with them focused on something directly relevant to what you're potentially hiring them to do, the more information you have. The typical interview process, even if you say, okay, we're going to have 8 people do these interviews and these people are going to focus on these technical skills, you get a few hours of information about them. You know, and that is such a tiny fraction of what you're counting on them for once they get inside. Sometimes it almost feels like a joke that you could actually make an informed decision after 8 hours of interviews, because you see so little of who they really are. So really anything that can increase that helps a lot. I mean, that's why it makes sense to hire the good people you already know, because you've had thousands of hours to see their work instead of an hour and one coding problem.
Yeah, I would just add, RJ, I mean, I think a trial period always makes a lot of sense. I would just make sure to talk to a lawyer to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's there, just to make sure from a hiring standpoint that you're in good shape. And then, you know, I love what you said, Chris, about hiring people you know, and in the spirit of that mosaic, I do think leaders can often say, oh, this person is perfect, let's just bring them aboard. And I would just encourage you, you know, make sure you have that diverse slate, because you may discover someone else along that process who might also be a great addition to your team, or who may be even better than that person that you know. I was recently reading Laszlo Block's book. He's the former chief people officer of Google. He has a great book called Work Rules. And I believe that they did research at Google, and they found that beyond 8 interviews, it was not a predictor of whether or not that person would be successful at Google. Now, that's just one company. But I think, to your point, Chris, like, how do you get the reality of who someone is as a performer? It's very, very hard in those experiences, but also not make it a laborious or overwhelming experience for your hiring team or for the candidate themselves. And that's, again, why I just come back to scenario-based interviews. I mean, have this person sit down with you for hours and do real problems together, real work together, give them feedback, see how they respond, really try to test them and put some fire under their feet. And I'm glad you asked the question. I think a lot of companies are experimenting with this, because if we got it right, we'd all have the perfect employees and we never have to exit low performers, but it's such a tricky process.
Yeah. I think it works for certain kinds of things, for specific skills. It's really hard, I think, to have an interview that really bottoms out on, you know, what are the motivations of this person? How are they going to be as a leader? I think people, particularly as they get more senior, get better at play acting. They can play the role of a senior manager. They can play the role of a VP of marketing very well. And it's really hard to distinguish you know, play acting from reality in a 2-hour interview. So references, if you can get them, certainly past experience is enormously valuable. And especially when what you're looking for is a lot of soft skills, of leadership skills, not just, you know, coding ability or ability to, you know, create a hiring plan. There's a lot of other things there. Though there is a correlation. You know, somebody who codes badly may not be the world's greatest VP of engineering. Yusuf, you have your hand up, I think.
Yes, I would like to ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to ask how much of this we should be prepared for from the beginning. Like, for example, these hiring, firing processes, and we will do this kind of process for this role, this kind of process for that role. Because sometimes when I read these books and listen to these things, it seems like almost an impossible task to be prepared for having starting a company. Like you need to be, or let's say, conflict resolution. If something happens like this, we will be doing this. Something happens like that, we will be doing this. How much of this should we really prepare for, and how much of that will be decided on the road?
Jenna, do you want to go
yeah,
first?
I can go first. I would say one of the things that I tried to do as a leader was to read a lot of different types of books. I mean, I read a lot of leadership books and people books, but I also read a lot of books that are completely disconnected from that. I love history because I think I learned so much about leadership just by reading about how people led through hard moments. I think a lot of what you're talking about, it's good to have the foundation, but some of it will just come through experience. I'll never forget the first time I had to let someone go and just how much my legs were shaking under the table. And I think nothing will prepare you for that first moment, in all the firsts, I would say. The other thing that I would suggest is that when I was a founder, I worked with an executive coach, and it changed how I led. It changed how successful the organization that I founded was. And a lot of what you work with a coach on, a lot of it can be strategy. You can build a strategy with your coach in one session as an example for X, Y, or Z. But a lot of my coaching sessions with my coach were, I need to give someone really hard feedback. I've never done that before. Let's talk through how I'll approach that. So I really encourage founders, if you don't have someone like that in your corner, a coach is different from a mentor. A coach will sit down with you for an hour and you can pick a topic and they'll help you self-reflect and come up with a plan together. Mentors are great at telling you how they've done something, but it may not be exactly how you would do it. And so I think it's important to have both a coach and a mentor, mentors as a founder. And Chris, I'm curious for your thoughts too.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I acknowledge that when you're at the very early stage of a startup, 95% of your energy is on the short term. It's how you and the other, 3 people are going to go get something done. And you're not spending energy on, what are the rituals that I need to have when we're 20 people, much less what are the rituals we need to have when we're 100 people. Those are later stages. But I didn't build a course called Startup Bootcamp the first 6 months. I'm trying to talk about some of the issues that happen really in the first 6 months, but make you aware that there are these subsequent stages. So don't worry about those things. But sometimes you will stay in that early stage for a long time. You could be years as, 5 people working together. But sometimes you get this sudden inflection point and you realize, my gosh, it's starting to work. In order for us to serve our customers, we need to be 20 people as soon as possible. And you wake up one morning and you are 20 people, and you need to be at least aware of the kinds of issues that happen, that start to come into play when you're 20 people. And then you keep your head down and doing that, and you suddenly wake up one morning and you're 100 people. And having some awareness a priori that these are the kinds of issues, if for no other reason, that when you wake up and you're suddenly 100 people, you don't panic when one of these kinds of issues comes along. So many of these things don't happen while you're in that very early stage, and they shouldn't worry you. You don't have to think about planning out every scenario. The most important thing is to get to that point at which you start to have the opportunity to scale, to be able to solve that next round of problems. But it's there to kind of get you mentally aware of what the route is. So it's like when you're driving, you need to have some awareness of where Chicago is, but you're not worrying about where the streetlights are, Right now, you're just trying to merge into traffic in Los Angeles. And there's a lot of just the tactical and existential things that have to do with driving the freeways in LA. Though you do know that you're going to be going to Chicago via Las Vegas, and you should be looking for the road sign for I-15 North in order to get there.
Hey, Chris, one other thing, you are the face of AI to me. Every time I talk with ChatGPT, I have a little Chris bubble floating in my head above it. And I was just thinking, Yusuf, with your question, like one thing that I didn't have as a founder that I think all of you have now are these AI tools. And they're not perfect. We all know that. But I do think that they're an amazing resource to say, hey, I have this underperforming employee. How should I approach this? How do I put this in writing? Give me talking points to have this conversation. Or we're trying to grow by 10 employees in the next year. We have 10 now. How do I think about building a hiring plan? I mean, it's absolutely incredible what these tools do. And so I would say leverage that as a resource too.
Yeah.
And have a good lawyer, for those really tricky situations on speed dial. Not to scare you, but every once in a while, it's good to have a lawyer.
Yeah, at least know of a lawyer that you can contact. If as a CEO of an early stage startup, you're thinking a lot about lawyers, you're probably overestimating the impact of lawyers. Lawyers should not be that important to you in the early stages because number one, you're so inconsequential that very few people are going to sue you. Maybe your former employees, you got to think a little bit about that, but other companies are not going to come after you legally because there's so little at stake. How would the lawyers get paid? and so don't worry over much about that aspect of it. But I think it is really valuable to think about, what are all of the tools you have available to you? And the AI chat tools at a minimum are a big upgrade on search, but they come with key caveats, which is they are consistently middle of the road, and they give kind of middle of the road quality of advice. They are great for giving you a sense of the diversity of possibilities. I use them all the time in order to expand my thinking about what are the factors to consider. But I'm uniformly skeptical about the details of those answers because they may be gross oversimplifications and in rare occasions just flat out wrong. So you need to develop healthy respect for the fact that they are bringing you a much wider, a much more diverse set of viewpoints than you can maybe get just sitting around the table with your two founders and saying, well, what do you know about this? But I think you have to be really careful about jumping on the specifics that sometimes come from these tools because they are built on the law of averages. Other questions here? Well, let me throw something in. Tell me about the early days of your startup, Jenna. What was that like? What was the vision that got you most excited? What was the biggest early stage issue you had to overcome to even get it off the ground?
I think every startup starts from, in my opinion, a place of hunger where you see something that doesn't exist and you feel that no one else is doing it and you have to do it. And I think that propels you through the hardest days of your startup. For me, there was a lack of quality schools for low-income students in Arizona. And so that was behind me starting the school that I did. It was a wild ride, Chris. I remember the first day of school, it was in Arizona, so it was 120 degrees. We had 10 different school buses. I was trying to load the kids on the bus. And it was, I was about to pass out. I mean, just very basic things of like milk. The kids would dump. They didn't finish their milk, and so they dumped it in this bucket. And then stupidly, I was in such a rush that I just tried to water a bush with it. But then you can imagine in 120 degrees, immediately it started smelling and we had to like dig the dirt out. I mean, these are just like the stupid mistakes that you make when you're moving like a hurricane. But I think, the most important lessons I learned were to have grace with yourself. You're going to make those mistakes. You will not have all the answers. I had an incredible board of directors and advisory board and set of mentors that I would go to and wasn't afraid to say what I didn't know. And that served me very well. And then you asked about the hardest challenge. I talked a little bit about this, but I think in our first year, we had really strong retention because it just felt like we were trying to win and just trying to get this off the ground. The second year, we had a big dip in retention. And I think that's because the adrenaline of the first year, it stopped carrying us through and we didn't have the cultural mechanisms to support the organization, to support our people that needed to be in place. And so that second year was really the third year, I should say, was about introducing those systems that you talked about, Chris, today. I wish I'd had your boot camp before I became a founder. And once we had those in place, listening mechanisms, a strong reward system, strong rituals, etc., then we had really tremendous culture, retaining almost 100% of our talent year over year in a very, very difficult hiring environment. But it was definitely the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also just the most incredible experience. And I grew so much as a leader and I have such immense pride. My school is building a second campus now. It served close to 5,000 students, and many of whom are graduating and going to college now. And so just creating something that has a legacy and an impact in the world is one of the greatest gifts of getting to be a founder. And I mean, I see that every day when a dog barks in a meeting here at Cisco, and I know, Chris, that you invented technology that helps us.
Not me.
Your organization.
I just told the story about it.
But I mean, that's another example of that incredible legacy. So yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. And thank you for sharing those thoughts and giving that other view of what does it take. I think one of the key messages here is that nobody, most especially including me, can tell you everything you need to know about doing a startup. A lot of it comes from within. A lot of it comes from the people around you with whom you share this passion. A lot of it, I think, is something I believe in a funny sort of way. I think the technology speaks to you. The technology tells you something about what's possible. And this is what makes tech startup different from the average startup, somebody who's starting a cookie store or starting a regional bank. Yeah, those are startups too. They have many things in common. But we are driving forward, trying to take the latent possibilities of some new technical capability, some new chip, some new AI model, some new algorithm, some new observation about what is becoming possible. And that helps to organize thoughts. It organizes who you need to hire. It helps to organize which customers are you going to go after. It certainly organizes what technologies are you going to need to develop around this idea. And it has such a proven track record of changing the world in important ways. Sometimes not in good ways. Who knew that we were all going to get so addicted by classic measures of addiction to our cell phones, but often in really good ways. And being part of that and being driven not just by the financial model, but being driven by the potential to make a lasting difference using this really wonderful puzzle called technology at the center of it is a great thing. It has impact. It has mostly profoundly beneficial impact on life and society. And especially if we're paying attention, it has profoundly beneficial impact. And it's something that can change the world. So I'm the very simple person. I just want to change the world and make it better.